Hegel thinks that the most important event in human history, the single biggest thing that ever happened to us, is the extended transition from long-standing traditional forms of life to distinctively modern ones. The great thinkers of the Enlightenment, in particular the philosophers in the tradition that leads from Descartes to Kant, worked out ideas that articulate the characteristically modern understanding of both our cognitive, practical, and political activity and of the world we know about and act in and on. But Hegel was the first to see modernity whole, the first to see those new Enlightenment modes of understanding as of a piece with the massive rolling changes in social, political, and economic institutions that gave rise to them and to which they gave voice. The first to see the Enlightenment as the form of consciousness and self-consciousness appropriate to a new world and a new way of being in that world. He introduces and develops an original conception of the subject of this great sea change, what he calls Geist, spirit. Geist is us as discursive beings, knowers and doers, and it includes all of our norm-governed doings, thinkings, sayings, practices, and institutions, and all their products. Prelapsarian traditional understanding took normative statuses to be features of the objective world. How it's proper to behave, how things ought to be done, what things are fitting, proper relations of subordination and superiority are all thought of as central features of how things anyway are, like the weight of stones or the color of the sky. The stations and duties are construed as being what they are antecedently to and independently of the practical attitudes of those whose stations and duties they are. It's the job of the individual subjects to reflect those self-standing normative statuses in their attitudes, to shape their acknowledgments and attributions of authority and responsibility so that they fit the normative facts. The principle defining traditional Sittlich forms of Geist is commitment to the norm-governedness or status dependence of normative attitudes. The contrasting core modern idea, articulated and developed by Enlightenment thinkers, is that there were no normative statuses of subordination and superiority, no authority and responsibility, until people started practically taking or treating each other as subordinates and superiors, authoritative and responsible. That modern idea is the idea of the attitude dependence of normative statuses. This idea takes a particularly clear and explicit form in social contract theories of political obligation. For there, attitudes of consent by the governed are treated as essential to the legitimate authority of those who govern, epitomized in the model of instituting normative statuses of reciprocal obligation by attitudes of intending to be bound, manifested practically by entering into an explicit contract or compact. On this model, norms are not found but made. Normative statuses are instituted by social, normative, practical attitudes, such as promising, agreeing, or contracting. Hegel both sees the replacement of traditional thought institutions and selves by modern ones as a decisive, irrevocable advance, and he also diagnoses it as a disruption that inevitably incurs substantial costs. The cover term he coins to characterize that unavoidable loss is alienation and fremdung. The largest philosophical lesson he thinks we can learn from thinking about the great structural shift of Geist from its pre-modern to its modern form is the result of the detailed interplay of gain and loss, advance and retreat that characterize that transition. The right understanding of how those interwoven strands are related points the way, he thinks, towards the third stage in the development of Geist. Such a third structure of Geist must retain the irreversible progress in self-consciousness of ourselves as free that consists in realizing the attitude dependence of normative statuses, while re-achieving practical Sittlich appreciation of the status dependence of normative attitudes, the way in which normative attitudes are obliged to respect and reflect norms that serve as standards of assessment for the correctness of those attitudes. Sittlichkeit is practically appreciating and responding to the obligation to conform our attitudes to the actual normative statuses those attitudes acknowledge and attribute. This is to aim at acknowledging and attributing what we and others are really committed to, our actual responsibilities. It's the loss of this Sittlich practical appreciation of the status dependence of normative attitudes that Hegel denominates alienation and takes to be a hallmark of modernity. What we're alienated from is the norms that we have made and that made us what we are. So there's a tension between the claim central to modernity that normative statuses are instituted by normative attitudes and the claim central to pre-modern understanding that normative statuses provide the standards for assessments of the correctness of attitudes. How can we both make the norms and be genuinely governed by them? Here one might think of Wittgenstein's observation that if whatever is going to seem right to me is right, that only means that here we can't talk about right. The third postmodern stage of Geist is defined by its reconciliation of these opposed insights. How does Hegel propose that these two criteria of adequacy on an account of the relation between normative attitudes and normative statuses can both be satisfied? The short answer, I think, is that our past attitudes institute norms that provide the normative standards of assessment for our current attitudes. He thinks that we institute norms that govern our attitudes by engaging in a special kind of process, recollection, Erinnerung. Recollection retrospectively, rationally reconstructs the prior applications of a concept, picking out an expressively progressive trajectory through them. To say that the rationally reconstructed tradition is expressively progressive is to say that it takes the form of the gradual emergence into explicitness of a determinate conceptual content, which provides a norm governing applications of that concept. That content is exhibited as having been all along implicit in those applications. Each such application reveals some contour of the concept. The process of recollection adopts an essentially retrospective perspective. The owl of Minerva flies only at dusk. It's this process that turns a mere past into a history, something with the edifying narrative structure of a tradition, a past as comprehended, Hegel says. Its reasons march through history. The idea of recollective rationality is one of Hegel's big ideas. In the rest of my talk, I want to drill down by looking at a special case of that recollective reconciliation of traditional and modern structures of norm-governed and norm-instituting practices, and the sort of understanding of them that's enabled by the meta-concepts of Hegelian Vernunft. The particular dimension of our Geistig attitudes that I'll address is intentional agency, and the self-conscious understanding of it, both theoretical and practical, that's an essential aspect of it. Hegel calls the traditional Sittlich practical understanding of intentional agency heroic. By this he means that agents take responsibility for their doings under all the descriptions true of those doings. No normative distinction is made between what's done intentionally, or what the agent knew he was doing, on the one hand, and what he did unintentionally and without realizing that that's what he was doing. So Oedipus is held responsible for killing his father and marrying his mother, even though he did not intend to do those things and was not aware that that's what he was doing. For those are still things he did, not things that just happened. Think of Enscombe, I do what happens. Oedipus did intend to and did kill that man and marry that woman. On the traditional heroic conception, it's the normative statuses that matter, not the agent's attitudes. Parricide and incest ought not to be. One should not act so as to incur the normative status of father killer or motherfucker. The ought-to-dos governing attitudes are just to be read off of the ought-to-bes that articulate statuses. Attitudes of knowing and intending matter only in determining that one is responsible for a deed, not for determining what one thereby did. The status one acquires by doing something is not itself construed as mitigated by or otherwise relativized in any way to the attitudes of intending or knowing in virtue of which it counts as one's doing in the first place. That one did not mean to do what one did can engender sympathy, but it cannot diminish responsibility. It's for this reason, Hegel thinks, that the traditional heroic practical conception of agency is inevitably always also a tragic conception. The tragedy doesn't consist just in the badness of the outcome. It consists in the fact that in acting at all, one puts oneself at the mercy of forces outside of one's knowledge and control. Those alien forces determine the content of one's actual deed, what one turns out to have done and to be responsible for having done. Hegel quotes in this connection a medieval European proverb, "When a flung stone leaves the hand, it belongs to the devil." Tragedy is the submission of the heroic agent to fate. The idea of fate invokes not some sort of determinism or antecedent necessitation of outcome, but just those dark, because unknowable and uncontrollable forces that engulf and overwhelm what's launched by one's limited knowledge and intention, transforming it into deeds that reach far beyond those attitudes into unforeseeable culpability. Shouldering the responsibility that fate in this sense brings down on one who acts is tragic heroism. This is the intimate, mutually presupposing relation between tragedy, fate, and heroism. By contrast to this tragic practical conception of agency in terms of heroic identification with submission to one's fate, the modern conception of agency is distinguished precisely by the idea that agents are genuinely responsible for, and so should be held responsible for, only what they intended to do and knew they were doing. As I talked about in my earlier lectures, Davidson well articulates the distinction at the core of the modern conception when he distinguishes among the specifications of things one has genuinely done between descriptions under which what one did is intentional, say turning on the light, and description of what one did that are merely consequential, alerting the burglar of whom one is unaware. What makes an event a doing at all, something that's imputable to an agent, is that it's intentional under some description. But that event then counts as a doing under all its specifications, including those that pick it out by consequences that were not intended or foreseen by the agent. But it's of the essence of the modern idea of practical responsibility that acknowledgments and attributions of the normative status of responsibility are conditioned by and proportional to the agent's attitudes of intending and believing. It's now seen to be unjust to condemn or blame someone for what they did because it satisfies consequential descriptions under which the agent did not intend it and could not foresee it. Those attitudes of agents, what they intend and believe, are taken to play constitutive roles in determining their normative status as culpable or admirable. This conception of responsibility as proportioned to intention and knowledge is the application to the practical understanding of intentional agency of the distinctively modern appreciation of the attitude dependence of normative statuses. The core of distinctively modern practical self-consciousness is, for Hegel, a special way of understanding what he calls the distinction that action implies. That's between what is purposed and what is accomplished in the realm of experience. It's to distinguish two senses in which agents do things, a narrower one and a wider one, and to restrict responsibility to what's done in the narrow sense. He says it's the right of the will to recognize as its action, Handlung, and to accept responsibility for only those aspects of its deed, Tat, which it knew to be presupposed within its end and which were present in its purpose, Vorsatz. I can be made accountable for a deed only if my will was responsible for it. That's the right of knowledge. There are two aspects possessed by practical consciousness, intention and deed, what is meant or intended by the deed, and the deed itself. Another quote, though any alteration is such which is set on foot by the subject's action is its deed, still the subject does not for that reason recognize it as its action, but only admits as its own what existence in the deed, that existence in the deed which lay in its knowledge and will, which was its purpose. Only for that does it hold itself responsible. He explicitly appeals to this distinction as marking a decisive difference from traditional practical conceptions of agency. He says, quote, the heroic self-consciousness, as in ancient tragedies like that of Oedipus, has not yet progressed from its unalloyed simplicity to reflect on the distinction between deed and action, between Tat and Handlung, between the external event and the purpose and knowledge of the circumstances, or to analyze the consequences minutely, but accepts responsibility for the deed in its entirety. End of the quote. Hegel takes it that making this distinction between Tat and Handlung is a decisive advance in understanding ourselves as agents. But this new level of practical self-consciousness courts the danger of a distinctive kind of alienation from its deeds. He says, consciousness, therefore, and he means modern consciousness, through its experience in which it should have found its truth, has really become a riddle to itself. The consequences of its deed are for it not the deeds themselves. What befalls it is for it not the experience of what it is in itself. The transition of action is not a mere alteration of the form of the same content and essence, presented now as the content and essence, and again as the object or outwardly beheld essence of itself. End of the quote. Now, I've been using a particular regimented normative metavocabulary to render the terms Hegel uses to set out the contrast between modern categories of Verstand and the forward-looking categories of Vernunft. It translates Hegel's talk of what subjects are in themselves and what they are for themselves and for others into talk of normative statuses and normative attitudes. Under the heading of normative statuses, what we are in ourselves, Hegel talks of independence and dependence, and I translate that into talk of authority and responsibility. And under the heading of normative attitudes, his talk of what subjects are for themselves and for others, I translate into talk about acknowledging responsibilities and claiming authority oneself, on the one hand, and attributing those statuses to others. In these terms, the conception of Vernunft is what explains the reciprocity of the normative statuses of authority and responsibility, the sense in which there are always two sides of one coin. It explains the reciprocity of normative recognitive attitudes of acknowledging and attributing authority and responsibility. And it explains the reciprocal dependences between these reciprocal relations among statuses and among attitudes. In doing so, it reconciles the distinctively modern insight into the attitude dependence of normative statuses, the sense in which statuses of authority and responsibility are instituted by reciprocal recognitive attitudes, with the traditional appreciation of the status dependence of normative attitudes, the dimension along which attributions and acknowledgments of commitments, responsibilities undertaken by exercising one's authority to do so, answer for their correctness to what agents are really committed to. The alienation that's the worm and the shining model of modernity is the practical incapacity to see how normative statuses can both be instituted by normative attitudes and transcend those attitudes so as genuinely to govern and constrain them. Kant's autonomy version of the Enlightenment idea that normative statuses are instituted by normative attitudes takes it that knowing and acting subjects are distinguished from merely natural creatures by a distinctive sort of authority that they have. That's the authority to commit themselves, the normative capacity of making themselves responsible by taking themselves to be responsible. Hegel applauds both the idea that the basic normative status is the authority to adopt normative attitudes, for Kant to acknowledge commitments, and the idea that normative statuses, here commitments, that is responsibilities, are instituted by normative attitudes. But Hegel objects to the idea that any individual's attitudes can immediately constitute normative statuses. That sort of authority he sees as an instance of the practical conception of normativity in terms of pure independence, authority without commensurate responsibility, independence without correlative dependence, that's characteristic of the master, whose commands unilaterally institute obligations, that is, responsibilities, for the slave. And from Hegel's point of view, it's a flaw in the Kantian autonomy account that this foundational normative status, the distinctive kind of authority to commit oneself, in virtue of which one is a discursive subject of cognitive commitments as to how things are, and practical commitments as to how things shall be, this foundational normative status is not construed by Kant as itself instituted by normative attitudes. It's treated just as a metaphysical fact. Hegel's idea is that we should understand the commitments of normative subjects as instituted not just by their own attitudes of acknowledgement, as Kant's autonomy model has it, but only by those attitudes when suitably complemented by attributions of those commitments to them by others, who attribute to them the authority so to commit themselves and so hold them responsible. That is, the authority to commit oneself is itself instituted in part by the attitudes of others who attribute it. Hegel's term for the attitude of attributing the basic Kantian normative status, that is the authority to adopt a status by adopting an attitude, making oneself responsible by taking oneself to be responsible, is recognition, Anerkennung. In place of Kant's individualistic autonomy model of the institution of normative statuses by normative attitudes, he proposes a social recognition model. According to that model, normative statuses are instituted by reciprocal recognition. To be responsible, one must, as Kant already insisted, in the first instance, acknowledge that responsibility. But one must also be held responsible by others, to whom one attributes the authority to adopt such authoritative attitudes. To attribute to someone the authority to hold one responsible, that is, to attribute commitments in a partly constitutive way, is to recognize that other subject. Hegelian recognitive attitudes, like Kantian autonomous attitudes, institute normative statuses, but they do so only when suitably socially complemented. The recognitive authority of individual normative subjects and of their recognitive communities are complementary and reciprocally dependent, that is, responsible to each other as well as authoritative over each other. On the recognitive picture, normative statuses are all instituted by normative attitudes, but only when those attitudes exhibit a particular structure, the structure of reciprocal recognition. Normative attitudes of acknowledging oneself and attributing responsibility to others, and of claiming or exercising authority for oneself and acknowledging the authority of or attributing authority to others, must be complementary to be efficacious. And in such a structure, the normative statuses of authority and responsibility those recognitive attitudes institute are always also reciprocal and coordinate. One might think, I think one clearly ought, to grant that there is at least a sense of normative status, paradigmatically of responsibility and authority, that's sensibly construed as socially instituted by reciprocal recognitive attitudes in the way required for what I've called basic Hegelian normative statuses. Even so, one might want to object that there are normative statuses that are more objective than these intersubjectively constituted and instituted ones. What's left out of the picture of normative statuses as instituted by reciprocal recognitive attitudes, one wants to say, is the fact that some normative statuses are objective in a sense that lets them serve as normative standards for assessment of the correctness of attitudes of attributing or claiming them. Just so, the attitude dependence of normative statuses, which motivates the models both of the basic Kantian normative metastatus of autonomy and of the basic Hegelian normative metastatus of reciprocal recognition, must somehow be balanced by acknowledgement of the status dependence of normative attitudes. The sense in which those attitudes of acknowledging and attributing normative statuses are responsible to the statuses that subjects actually have. The sense in which those attitudes are themselves norm-governed. Understanding that aspect of the relations between normative attitudes and normative statuses, and incorporating that understanding into our practices and institutions, is what's required to move Geist from its modern to its postmodern phase. We're to do that by moving from practically construing ourselves and our discursive activities according to metaconcepts exhibiting the structure of Verstand, to construing ourselves and our discursive activities according to metaconcepts exhibiting the structure of Vernunft. The key, I think, to understanding the way Hegel moves beyond the basic Hegelian normative statuses, socially instituted by synchronic reciprocal relations of recognitive attitudes, consists in appreciating the orthogonal diachronic historical dimension of recognitive processes. It's in particular the recollective phase of diachronic recognitive processes that explains the attitude transcendence of normative statuses. That includes the special cognitive representational norms according to which representing attitudes are responsible for their correctness to standards set by what counts as represented by those representings just in virtue of exercising that distinctive kind of authority over them. Discursive norms, both practical and cognitive, are understood according to the categories of Vernunft as features of essentially social and historical recognitive processes, developing in tandem with the attitudes that articulate them. Understanding operating according to the categories of Verstand is blind to both the social and the historical dimensions of conceptual norms. want to look more closely at how the transition to the third stage of Geist is described and motivated. The spirit chapter of the Phenomenology rehearses the progressive development from the traditional to the modern structure of Geist, so as to prepare us readers for the epiphany in which that development culminates, the envisaged transition to the third postmodern stage, the age of trust. Hegel introduces this newly self-conscious form of normativity, and hence subjectivity, in the rhetorical form of a pair of allegories: the allegory of the hero and his valet, and the allegory of the penitent confessing his transgression to the hard-hearted, unforgiving judge. Hegel introduces the first with a well-known slogan of his day: "No man is a hero to his valet," followed by his own twist on it. Not, however, because the man is not a hero, but because the valet is a valet. The hero is allegorical for one who acts out of appreciation of his duty, one who fulfills his responsibility, one who acts as he ought, as he's committed to act, one who in his practical attitudes and actions acknowledges the bindingness or authority of norms. Valet is the English translation of the German Kammerdiener, literally room servant. The valet in the allegory sees the attitudes of the hero not as governed by and expressive of the acknowledgement of norms, but as the product of immediate sensuous desires and contingent particular inclinations. The valet views what the hero does genealogically, in resolutely naturalistic, non-normative, reductive terms. And so, Hegel says, long quote, explains the action as resulting from selfish motives. Just as every action is capable of being looked at from the point of conformity to duty, so too it can be considered from the point of view of the particularity of the doer. If the action is accompanied by fame, then it knows the inner aspect to be a desire for fame. The inner aspect is judged to be an urge to secure his own happiness, even though this were to consist merely in an inner moral conceit, in the enjoyment of being conscious of his own superiority, and the foretaste of a hope of future happiness. No action can escape such judgment. For duty's sake, this pure purpose is an unreality. It becomes a reality in the deed of an individuality, and the action is thereby charged with the aspect of particularity. End of the quote. The Kammerdiener in the allegory stands for a view that explains all attitudes in terms of other attitudes, without needing to appeal to governing norms that they're attitudes towards and acknowledgments of. Hegel doesn't deny that this sort of explanation in terms of attitudes alone can be done. The norm-blind, reductive naturalist perspective is an available perspective. But we can ask to begin with, what sort of disagreement is it that divides the Kammerdiener and the friend of the norms, for whom some heroes really are heroes? Is it a cognitive, matter-of-factual disagreement about what there is in the objective world? After all, for Hegel, modernity was right that normative statuses are attitude-dependent. Hegel diagnoses the issue as a difference in meta-attitude. He denominates the norm-blind, reductive naturalism for which the Kammerdiener stands, niederträchtig. The contrasting norm-sensitive, hero-aware meta-attitude that takes some attitudes to be themselves genuinely norm-sensitive and norm-acknowledging, he calls edelmütig. So, perhaps there's just a subjective practical choice to be made, depending on one's preference for tough-minded, skeptical Niederträchtigkeit or tender-minded, generous Edelmütigkeit? That's not Hegel's view either. These two possibilities, matter of objective fact or of subjective preference, exhaust the possibilities that modern Verstand admits. But Hegel thinks rather that in being discursive beings at all, in believing and acting, we've already implicitly committed ourselves to an edelmütig meta-attitude. This is a possibility afforded by the understandings of Vernunft, which, when it comes to explicit self-consciousness, ushers in the postmodern structure of Geist. The issue addressed by the allegory of the Kammerdiener concerns the intelligibility of the traditional idea of the status dependence of normative attitudes in the face of the modern insight into the attitude dependence of normative statuses. The Kammerdiener stands for the self-sufficiency, the explanatory sovereignty of attitudes. But then what room is there for the authority and efficacy of norms, for the idea that normative statuses of authority and responsibility what one's really entitled or committed to, make a real difference to attitudes that accordingly deserve to be thought of as acknowledgments of those norms. Normative governance of attitudes by norms has two dimensions, deontic and alethic. First, the norms, the normative statuses, serve as standards for assessment of the correctness of attitudes. My attitudes of acknowledging a commitment myself or attributing a commitment to others are correct just in case we really are committed, in case those attitudes properly reflect the statuses that they're attitudes towards. This is what it is for the attitudes in question to be normative attitudes, that is, attitudes towards norms, attitudes of acknowledging or attributing normative statuses. Second, the norms they're attitudes towards should make a difference to the adoption of those attitudes. The attitudes must be subjunctively sensitive to the normative statuses they acknowledge and attribute. This is to say that the norms are efficacious, in that if the content of the norm being acknowledged or attributed were or had been different, the attitude would be different. The heroism of the hero is allegorical for the norm-governedness of attitudes in this dual sense. The correctness of his attitudes is to be assessed according to the standard provided by the norms he acknowledges, and his practical attitudes are sensitive to the contents of those norms, in the sense that if the norms were different, the hero's attitudes would be different. The challenge allegorically represented by the Kammerdiener is to make the possibility of the status dependence of normative attitudes so much as intelligible in the face of the standing possibility, which Hegel acknowledges, of purely naturalistic genealogical alternative accounts of the advent of normative attitudes, accounts that appeal only to other attitudes. If invocation of normative governance of attitudes by normative statuses is not necessary to account for the attitudes, how can it be legitimate? Insofar as this reductive naturalist challenge to the normativity of agency can't be met convincingly, the result will be alienation from the norms, the loss of traditional Sittlich practical appreciation of the status dependence of normative attitudes. The second allegory, of the confessing miscreant and the hard-hearted judge, presents a different sort of challenge to the intelligibility of the governance of practical attitudes by norms. It stems from Kantian rigorism about what's required for genuine responsiveness to norms, rather than stemming from reductive naturalism, as the Kammerdiener allegory does. What the miscreant confesses is the admixture of non-normative attitudes in the causes of his action. He confesses he did not act just out of acknowledgement of pure duty for duty's sake. Other attitudes also provided motives to which his action was subjunctively sensitive, in the sense that if they had been different, and the norm not, what was done would have been different. Subjunctive sensitivity was not limited to the content of the norm being acknowledged. The doing was in this regard both more than and less than a pure acknowledgement of the norm. Here the challenge is not that treating the performance as the acknowledgement of a norm is not necessary to explain the practical attitude, but rather that it's not sufficient. And if invocation of normative governance is not by itself sufficient to account for attitudes, because an admixture of contingent particular motives and circumstances, what the penitent confesses, is always also in play, if it's not sufficient to account for the attitudes, how can it be legitimate? The challenge to the intelligibility of normative governance comes from the idea that the authority of norms over attitudes must be total in order to be genuine. It's a manifestation, Hegel thinks, of the deformed conception of pure independence. The idea that authority, normative independence, is undercut by any sort of correlative responsibility to or dependence on anything else. This is the practical normative conception Hegel criticizes allegorically under the rubric of mastery. Hegel sees Kant as perfectly distilling the essence of the modern form of this conception as part of his otherwise progressive understanding of normativity in terms of autonomy. As a result, Kant adopts a contraction strategy in which genuine doings shrink down to mere willings, since every more robust sense of action involves responsibility to other factors, subjective and objective, which are not themselves in the same sense governed by the norm that rationalizes the willing. In the allegory, the hard-hearted judge is the Kantian rigorist, who takes it that the penitent's confession of an admixture of non-normative motives shows that the action does not also express the acknowledgement of a norm, and so must be judged lawless. The affinity to the reductive naturalism of the Kammerdiener should be clear. For there, too, the mere possibility of a non-normative reductive naturalistic explanation of attitudes is taken to preempt the normative governance explanation, and in that sense to deny the authority of the norm. If the normative governance account of an attitude has a rival, it's taken to have no authority at all. Independence is seen as incompatible with any sort of dependence. Any correlative responsibility undermines claims of authority. Unlike the Kammerdiener allegory, the allegory of the hard-hearted judge is extended to provide a path forward to a proper understanding of the status dependence of normative attitudes. Hegel presents the structural transition from modern to postmodern conceptions of agency in the form of a parable, a narrative recounting sequential stages in the relation between an evil consciousness and a hard-hearted judge. Evil, judgment, confession, refusal of reciprocal confession, the breaking of the hard heart and confession by the judge, forgiveness, and finally the achievement of a new kind of community, quote, the reconciling yea in which the two I's let go of their antithetical existence is the existence of the I, which is expanded into a duality. This is the final vernunftlich postmodern form of reciprocal recognition, and so of normativity and Geist, structured by normativity instituted by the newly self-conscious form of recognition. What the contrite agent confesses is that everything in its deed that's not norm-governed. In Hegel's idiom, every manifestation of particularity, the agent's circumstances and collateral attitudes in the form of intentions or beliefs and of contingent unintended consequences, rather than universality, the norm, the governing normative status. It confesses every failure of the status dependence of practical attitudes whose content is revealed in the deed is actually done. Confession, Verständnis, in this sense, is at once a performance partly constitutive of a special form of self-consciousness and a petition for recognition. The connection is forged by Hegel's understanding of self-consciousness itself as the social product of mutual recognition. In Hegel's allegory, confession is not met with an edelmütig, reciprocating recognition, but with a niederträchtig, merely critical assessment of failure to fulfill responsibilities, the failure of attitudes to be normatively governed by statuses. The blaming, hard-hearted, Kantian rigorous judge plays the role of the moral valet to the penitent agent, Hegel says. Quote, the consciousness that judges in this way is itself base, niederträchtig, because it divides up the action, producing and holding fast to the disparity of the action with itself. Further, it's hypocrisy, because it passes off such judging not as another manner of being wicked, but as the correct consciousness of the action, setting itself up in this unreality and conceit of knowing well and better above the deeds it discredits, and wanting its words without deeds to be taken for a superior kind of reality. End of the quote. The judge's attitudes are exclusively adopted from the perspective of normative assessment. The judge, as assessor, does not identify with the perspective of the deliberating agent, or even acknowledge the essentially complementary roles in constituting normative statuses played by attitudes of assessment and deliberation, that is, attribution to another and acknowledgement oneself of practical commitments. The point of this episode in the allegory is to enforce the contrast with the next step. The breaking of the hard heart describes the adoption by the assessing consciousness of the appropriate edelmütig recognitive response to the petition for recognition that is the penitent's confession. That response Hegel denominates forgiveness, Verzeihung. To understand the structure of normativity that gives Geist its characteristic postmodern shape, we must understand the constellation of reciprocal recognitive attitudes that institutes that structure. This is recognition in the form of mutual confession and forgiveness, the structure I call trust. As I read the allegory, the shift to forgiveness that is the breaking of the judge's hard heart is a move from the judge merely attributing responsibility for the agent's deed to the judge practically acknowledging his own responsibility for that deed. As such, it's an act of identification with the doer, by making oneself co-responsible for what was done. The appropriate response to confession of an incapacity to produce deeds that are simply and purely governed by norms is for the judge to make a corresponding confession, to acknowledge, as Hegel says, I am as you are, admitting that the judge, like the agent, is also doomed to act from a mixture of attitudes that are acknowledgments of governing norms and attitudes that are not such acknowledgments of governing norms. In the words of the popular philosopher, we're all bozos on this bus. The responsibility the assessing consciousness undertakes for what is done is complementary to the responsibility the deliberating consciousness undertakes in its act. It's not identical to it, just complementary with it. It has, I think, two dimensions, reparative and recollective. The reparative responsibility is practically to intervene in the still unfolding consequences of the doing, which provide an ever-increasing stock of consequential specifications of it. The deed is never done, and part of the generous edelmütig way of holding someone responsible for what they do is to acknowledge responsibility for helping them make it turn out well. One can do that by practically contributing new consequences, thereby making true new consequential specifications of the deed. When everyone does acknowledge a responsibility to do that, each doing by a member of the community, whose constitutive recognitive attitudes to one another takes the form of confession and forgiveness, each of their doings is a doing of all. The deed of each is the deed of all. Here I think of Dumas's Musketeers slogan, all for one and one for all. But we could ask, well, what counts as better consequences? The standard for such normative assessments of consequences is set by the other, recollective dimension of forgiveness. The reparative responsibility to ameliorate the consequences of the doing being forgiven must be understood in terms of recollection. The aim is to make the whole that results from one's current action, thought of as a contribution to a tradition, a more fully and successfully recollectable than that tradition would otherwise be. So this constraint, too, is defined in terms of recollection. It's the norms of recollection that determines what count as better consequences, and to which contributing to such consequences must be subjunctively sensitive. Indeed, recollective forgiveness is the key to understanding norm governance in general. Taking recollective responsibility for another's doing is practically acknowledging the obligation to tell and endorse a certain kind of retrospective story about that doing. That's the responsibility to rationally reconstruct it as norm-governed. The forgiving recollector must discern an implicit norm that governs the development of the deed. This is the intention in the sense of Absicht, which stands to the consequentially extended Tat as the agent's initial Vorsatz stands to the Handlung, the narrower action specified only under the descriptions explicitly licensed by the purpose for which it was performed. The Absicht must be exhibited as normatively governing the doing in the dual sense of both serving as a normative standard for assessment of the practical attitudes it governs, each specification of the doing being thought of as an acknowledgement of that norm, and as being the norm that those attitudes can be seen to have been subjunctively sensitive to, in the sense that had the norm been different, so would those attitudes. One recolectively discerns or imputes a norm that is in the form of an Absicht, something that governs the practical process as what's being striven for or aimed at. Saying that goes beyond just saying that it serves as a normative standard for assessments of the success of practical attitudes. For that could be true without entailing that anyone cares about the standard and is making decisions in the light of what the norm enjoins. The additional element involves thinking of each component of the subsequent retrospectively constructed or discovered tradition as surrounded by a cloud of incompatible alternatives. The recollective forgiver then practically takes or treats the subject of the attitude in question as choosing the alternative taken, the one incorporated in the recollective recognitive forgiveness narrative, as having selected it out of the cloud of relevant alternatives. This is what it is to treat the governing norm not just as a norm of assessment, but as an object. This is rationally reconstructing a tradition of attitudes that are status-dependent, in the sense of being governed, in the dual sense, by an implicit norm that becomes gradually more explicit as it's acknowledged by the attitudes incorporated in the recollected tradition. The meta-norm that governs recollective performances and the practical attitudes they express is that the norm one reconstructively discerns or imputes must normatively govern all the consequential specifications of attitudes downstream from the Handlung. That includes the practical reparative and hermeneutic recollective attitudes that the assessing judge herself adopts. So the forgiving agent must endorse the norm being attributed as governing the deed, must acknowledge its authority. That's part of taking co-responsibility for it. In forgiving, one makes oneself responsible for the emerging norm one attributes as the implicit object of the deed. That's identifying with the agent, in the sense of risking and, if need be, sacrificing one's own other attitudes by subjecting them to normative assessment according to the norm one both attributes and acknowledges, and being subjectively sensitive oneself to that norm in one's own attitudes. In this specific sense, the forgiving agent acknowledges the doing as its own, as the doing not only of the agent who initiated it, but also of the forgiving recollector. Forgiving recollection can be understood on the model of the institutional common or case law jurisprudential practices that I've mentioned a number of times. There, the current judge rationally reconstructs the tradition by selecting a trajectory of prior precedential decisions that are expressively progressive, in that they reveal the gradual emergence into explicitness of a norm, the content of the law, that can be seen to have implicitly governed all the decisions or attitudes in the reconstructed tradition. It implicitly governed them in the dual sense of serving as a standard and having the precedential attitudes revealed to be subjunctively sensitive to it. It's that norm that then justifies the current judge's decision. The norm that's seen as emerging from the rationally reconstructed tradition of decisions sets the standard for normative assessment by future judges of the current decision, which claims to be itself subjunctively sensitive to that very norm. So the recollecting judge subjects herself to, acknowledges the authority of, the norm she retrospectively discerns. The more of the prior decisions the recollection rationalizes and exhibits as expressive of the norm, the better the recollective warrant that norm provides for the current decision. Whatever residue there is of decisions that cannot be fit into the retrospectively rationally reconstructed tradition as precedentially rationalizing and expressive of the norm increases the scope for criticism of the current decision by future judges, who may or may not acknowledge it as correct and itself precedential. For the only authority the decision has derives from its responsibility to the tradition of prior decisions that it reconstructs. Forgiving, on this account, is hard work. It can't be brought off with a single sweeping, abstractly general gesture, "I forgive you for what you did." One could always say that, but saying it wouldn't make it so. Besides commitment to practically affect the consequences of the doing one is forgiving, one must produce a concrete recollective reconstruction of the deed under all of its intentional and consequential specifications. Recollection is a making, the crafting of a distinctive kind of narrative that's successful only insofar as it ends up being recognizable as having the form of a finding. Doing that seems perverse, but it's what you have to do to give contingency the normative form of necessity. Recollection is the narrative genre in which the rationalization of decisions appealing to common or case law also belongs. One must recruit and assemble the raw materials one inherits so as to exhibit a norm one can endorse oneself as always having governed the tradition to which oneself belongs, with which one identifies. A tradition that shows up in one's recollective story as progressively revealing a governing norm, making ever more explicit what was all along implicit. The expressively progressive tradition discerned culminates, at least for now, in the consequential specification of the doing that is the recollection itself. But we can ask, what if what one's given to work with is just too hard to forgive? What if the subject of the attitude that's being forgiven as part of a larger enterprise of forgiving something upstream of it is in fact dispositionally unresponsive to the verdict of the norm? What if, as the Kammerdiener alleges, it in fact is sensitive only to other particular concerns of its subject? It seems that the criteria of adequacy for successful forgiveness, both reparative and recollective, are in many cases just impossible to satisfy. Some things people have done, we want to say, are simply unforgivable. In some cases, though we might try to mitigate the consequences of evil doings, we have no idea at all how to go about discerning the emergence of a governing norm that we could endorse ourselves. Any actual recollective story will involve strains, elements of what's actually done at every stage in the developing process that cannot be smoothly, successfully, or convincingly given such a norm-responsive explanation. Well, indeed. But now we must ask, whose fault is it that the doing is unforgivable? The doer or the forgiver? Is the failure that of a bad agent or of a bad recollector? Is whose fault it is a factual matter of how things anyway just are? Or is it at least partly reflecting the recollector's failure to come up with a more norm-responsive narrative? The first is the attitude of the unsittlich valet, for whom no one is a practically norm-acknowledging hero, in the sense of being genuinely responsive and sensitive to norms. To treat the recollective failure as wholly the fault of the doer, to take it as simply an objective fact that there's no norm we could endorse that governs the deed as the assessor inherits it, is to adopt exactly the blaming practical attitude of the hard-hearted judge, an attitude that Hegel criticizes as niederträchtig. The contrasting edelmütig attitude he recollectively recommends as implicit in the idea of norm governance as such is rather to identify with the doer and take co-responsibility for the doing. That's to acknowledge at least equal responsibility on the part of the unsuccessful forgiver. For the issue is not properly posed in alethic modal terms of the possibility or impossibility of forgiving what's done. It's a deontic normative matter. One is committed to forgiving, responsible for forgiving. We have here a Hegelian version of a Kantian regulative ideal. And that governing regulative ideal is to comprendre, c'est to pardonner. One can be committed to that ideal, normatively governed by it in the dual sense, even if one must confess that in many cases one cannot understand and so forgive at all. It might well be that one is in fact incapable of fulfilling that commitment, of carrying out that responsibility. If and insofar as that's so, it's a normative failure that the unsuccessful would-be forgiver should confess. To take proper recognitive recollective responsibility requires the forgiving agent to confess its own inadequacy to the recollective task. Your confession of a failure of your practical attitudes appropriately to acknowledge a norm is a petition for my recognition in the form of my forgiving taking of co-responsibility for your doing. My subsequent failure to adopt adequately forgiving recollective recognitive attitudes is something I'm responsible for confessing. That confession is itself an act of identification with you. I am as you are. My attitudes, like yours, fail adequately to satisfy the norms that they nevertheless acknowledge as binding, as governing those attitudes. For one acknowledges an obligation, the bindingness of a governing norm, insofar as one confesses the extent to which one has been unresponsive to the demands of the recollective norm, unable to fulfill a responsibility one acknowledges. And one is genuinely sensitive to that normative demand in making such a confession. Confessing is what one must do to make it the case that one is in fact sensitive to the norm recollected as governing the attitudes that make up the tradition one has discerned, including one's own attitudes, even though one is incapable of fulfilling the responsibility one thereby acknowledges. As an edelmütig, forgiving assessor of another's doing, one confesses that it's also one's own fault that one is not good enough at forgiving. And one must trust that this failure too, like the failure of the original inadequately forgiven doer, will be more successfully forgiven by future assessors, who know more and are better at it. That one cannot successfully tell a recollective story is not what matters. That's a deontic failure relative to one's commitments. It's something to be confessed in trust that that failure too can be forgiven. The well-meaning but incompetent forgiving recollector's confession, like that of the contrite agent, is a petition for recognition in the form of forgiveness. The trusting confession of recollective failure completes the identification of the one playing the role of assessor with the one playing the role of agent. The recognitive attitudes of forgiveness and confession emerge as two sides of one coin, two aspects of a symmetric recognitive structure, the norm-instituting structure of trust. Its slogan is, attribute responsibility forgivingly, acknowledge responsibility contritely. In a normative community with this recognitive structure, everyone forgives to the limits of their ability, and everyone confesses those limits and trusts that they too will be forgiven. The content of the shared recognitive attitudes with which all parties identify is, forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass before us. It's of the essence of both the reparative, ameliorating dimension and the hermeneutic, recollecting dimension of the recognitive attitude of forgiveness that they address a performance that expresses a prior practical attitude. The doing being forgiven must already be underway. For this reason, the final vernünftig form of reciprocal recognition as confession and forgiveness is essentially historical. The attitude governing norms it institutes and acknowledges have the rich diachronic recognitive form of traditions. Hegel himself practices forgiving recollection, retrospectively rationally reconstructing expressively progressive traditions in his own accounts of intellectual and cultural history, and particularly in the way he reads the history of art, religion, and especially philosophy. And it's what I mean to be practicing in the stories that I tell about on Hegel's behalf. The claim that's crucial for understanding the third age of Geist as retaining the progress made by modernity while overcoming its structural alienation is that recognition understood as including the recollective institution of traditions acknowledges both the attitude dependence of normative statuses and the status dependence of normative attitudes. On the one hand, it incorporates the insight that norms, normative statuses, are instituted by reciprocal recognition, that is, by recognitive attitudes that are symmetric in the sense of being suitably complemented. On the other hand, each recollective rational reconstruction is obliged to display the normative attitudes it addresses as governed by norms, normative statuses, in the dual sense of being subject to assessment according to those norms and of being subjunctively sensitive to them. In this way, the postmodern recognitive practices re-achieve a Sittlich appreciation of the authority of norms over attitudes, the sense in which attitudes are responsible to, governed by, norms that they acknowledge and attribute. It's true that acknowledgement of the authority of governing norms is always within the scope of a recollective, rational, reconstructive story about what goes on. The normative status on which attitudes are understood as dependent, to which they're responsible, is itself always the object of a recollective attitude. In this sense, the overall account invokes nothing but attitudes. But that attitudes are status-dependent, norm-governed, is an essential, necessary, and characteristic structural feature of every recollective attitude as such. And in that sense, the status dependence of normative attitudes is not merely a contingent product of some attitudes people happen to adopt. It's in the end what makes normative attitudes, acknowledgments and attributions of normative statuses of responsibility and authority. Agency, in the age of trust, re-achieves the heroic character, so striking in the original ancient form of agency, that was pushed out by the ironic distancing and alienation from norms essential to the achievement of individual self-consciousness that is the triumph of modern over traditional forms of normative life. Central to heroism was what Hegel called character, the decisive Sittlich identification of an individual agent with the norms, practically treating them as authoritative over and binding on one's attitudes. This is an acknowledgement of the status dependence of normative attitudes, of one's attitudes as norm-governed. The ought-to-dos governing normative attitudes, acknowledged or attributed responsibilities, are understood as wholly determined by the ought-to-bes that articulate normative statuses, what someone is really responsible for or committed to, their duty. As a result, the heroic agent takes responsibility for every aspect of his act. If some feature of it is not as it ought to be, that's confessed to be the agent's responsibility, whether or not it was intended or foreseen. Compared to the contracted modern conception, the heroic conception makes the agent primarily responsible for a much expanded deed, stretching out to include distant, unanticipated consequences. For this reason, traditional heroism is essentially tragic. It requires subjecting oneself to the dark, unknowable power of fate, identifying with what one is made by forces beyond one's knowledge and control. Shouldering the responsibility that fate in this sense brings down on one who acts is tragic heroism. Heroism in the age of trust is like heroism in the age of tragedy in its Sittlich acknowledgement of the bindingness of norms, in the sense of their governing authority over normative attitudes, the status dependence of those attitudes. They're norms that set standards for assessment of the correctness of our attitudes of acknowledging and attributing responsibility and authority. And it's the responsibility of each agent to be sensitive to those norms, shaping its attitudes accordingly. Each forgiving, retrospective, recollective, rational reconstruction of an expressively progressive tradition of attitudes is responsible for discerning just such governing norms. And where the cramped and contracted modern practical conception of agency drew a bright line between normatively attributable and assessable aspects of each doing and non-normative ones, between what the agent can properly be held responsible for, because done knowingly or intentionally, and what's done only in the sense of happening because of such doings in the narrowing sense, the trusting conception is heroic, like the tragic conception, in that responsibility is total. Responsibility is taken for the whole deed. There's no aspect of intentional doings that overflows and falls outside the normative realm of responsibility. No specification of the deed for which no one takes responsibility. In Geist, with the recognitive structure of trust, responsibility for the deed is shared between the agent whose attitudes initiated the doing, and the members of her recognitive community, who take it as their own by committing themselves to forgiving it. Agency is understood and practiced within the magnanimous recognitive structure of confession and forgiveness, combines these two heroic aspects of the pre-modern conception: a Sittlich appreciation of the status dependence of normative attitudes, and acknowledging total responsibility for the deed as consequentially extended beyond the knowledge and the control of the agent. It can maintain a heroic conception of the deed for which responsibility is taken because it has an expanded conception of who's responsible for each doing. Complementary recognitive attitudes both institute the governing norms and acknowledge the authority of the norms so instituted. The essentially historical fine structure of those reciprocally related recognitive attitudes and normative statuses articulates a division of normative labor between the agent, whose practical attitudes initiate a self-conscious intentional doing, who takes responsibility for it in one sense, and members of the agent's recognitive community, who take responsibility for it in another sense. In this way, the two essentially modern insights into the attitude dependence of normative statuses and the distinction of responsibility marked by the individual agent's rights of intention and knowledge, the distinction between Handlung and Tat, are respected and synthesized with the two principal features of pre-modern heroic agency. But the Vernunftlich conception of agency as heroic does away with the element of tragic subjection to fate. Fate showed up as an alien, inhuman force in the tragic form of agency because it was a non-normative force, one that is not itself governed by norms, but nonetheless substantially shapes our normative responsibilities. What was left up to us was just bearing up and carrying on in the face of the results of the incursions by fate into the properly normative realm. The non-heroic form of practical normativity replaces fate with something we do. The neo-heroic form of practical normativity replaces fate with something we do. What happens is given the form of something done. Immediacy, contingency, particularity, and their recalcitrance to conceptualization are not done away with, but they now take their proper place. for we appreciate the necessary role they play in the process of determining the contents of the norms we both institute by our recognitive attitudes and acknowledge as governing that experiential process. The burdens of tragic subjection to fate are replaced by the tasks of concrete magnanimous forgiveness. Where our normative digestion and domestication of immediacy, contingency, and particularity shows its limitations, when, as in each case at some point they must, they outrun our recollective capacity to incorporate them into the mediated normative conceptual form of governing universals, that failure of ours is properly acknowledged by confession and trust in the forgiveness of that failure to fulfill our responsibilities by more capable future recollectors. Hegel says, at the very end of the Phenomenology, the wounds of the spirit heal and leave no scars behind. The deed is not imperishable. It's taken back by spirit into itself, and the aspect of individuality present in it, whether as intention or as an existent negativity and limitation, straightway vanishes. The self that carries out the action, the form of its act, is only a moment of the whole. And so likewise is the knowledge that by its judgment determines and establishes the distinction between the individual and universal aspects of the action. End of the quote. The responsibility the individual tragic heroic agent takes on himself is accordingly spread out and shared. The doing of each, in one sense, is now in a real sense the doing of all, in another recognitively complementary sense. For all share responsibility for each action. The distinctive role played by individual agents is not obliterated, for the responsibility acknowledged by and attributed to the initiating agent is different from the reparative and recollective responsibility undertaken by those who take up the burden of forgiving the agent. Every deed now shows up both as a practical contribution to the content of all that came before it, and as acknowledging a recollective responsibility with respect to all those deeds. The temporally extended, historically structured recognitive community of those who are alike in all confessing the extent of their failure to be norm-governed, acknowledging their responsibility to forgive those failure in others, confessing the extent of their efforts at recollective and reparative forgiveness, and trusting that a way will be found to forgive their failures, is one in which each member identifies with all the other, taking co-responsibility for their practical attitudes. It is, as Hegel says, the I that is we and the we that is I. Thank you.